The final dance when pride met human precision. The grand arena of Celestia Prime sparkled under three suns, its crystalline spires reaching toward the violet sky like frozen lightning. Queen Valara stood at her royal balcony, her scaled skin shimmering with iridescent patterns that reflected her growing irritation. Her four arms were crossed in pairs across her chest as she watched the latest battle simulation playing out on the massive holographic displays before her. Another human colony, established right at the edge of the Crimson Belt, she said, her voice carrying the weight of centuries of royal breeding. They breed like stellar parasites, spreading their influence across every habitable rock they find. Lord Nexus, her most trusted advisor, stood 3 respectful steps behind her. His ceremonial armor clicked softly as he shifted his weight. The humans claim it was unclaimed space, your luminescence. Unclaimed Valara turned, her head crest flaring with spots of angry red. That sector has been under Celestian observation for the past 3 millennia. We were planning to establish research outposts there within the next century. Perhaps, my queen, but the humans operate on different timescales than we do, Nexus offered carefully. A century to them is an eternity. Yes, Valara waved one of her lower arms dismissively. Their brief lives make them impatient, reckless. But that does not excuse their constant encroachment upon spaces that rightfully belong to the Celestian Empire. The Queen's attention shifted to the arena below, where her champion, Krax the Unyielding, was conducting his daily training routine. His massive form moved with a fluid grace that seemed impossible for someone of his size. Each strike of his ceremonial blade created small sonic booms that echoed through the arena. Look at him, Nexus. 23,000 cycles undefeated. The pride of our warrior caste. A smile crept across Valara's face, causing ripples of golden light to dance across her scales. Perhaps it's time we reminded these humans why the Celestian Empire has endured for millions of their years. Krax finished his routine with a thunderous strike that shattered 3 training drones simultaneously. His secondary arms twirled his blade in the traditional salute, while his primary arms clasped in front of his chest. Even from this distance, the power radiating from him was palpable. Your champion is indeed formidable, my Queen, Nexus agreed, but the humans have proven unpredictable in the past. Unpredictable, Valara laughed, a sound like chiming bells. They are transparent in their motivations: wealth, resources, expansion. Simple creatures with simple desires. She turned to face her advisor fully. And simple creatures need simple lessons. Nexus's facial ridges twitched with concern. What do you propose, your luminescence? A challenge, dear Nexus. In the old way, Valara's eyes gleamed with anticipation. We shall invoke the right of combat arbitration, 1 warrior from each civilization, fighting for the rights to the disputed territories. The humans might not accept such a challenge, Nexus cautioned. Their diplomatic corps tends to prefer negotiation. They will accept, Valara declared, watching as Krax began another set of training exercises below. Because if they don't, they admit their weakness before the entire galactic community. Their pride won't allow it. She raised all 4 arms, her scales now pulsing with patterns of royal authority. Send the message to their ambassador. Tell them that Queen Valara of the Celestian Empire challenges the Human Federation to send their greatest warrior to face our champion. The winner civilization shall have uncontested rights to the Crimson Belt and all territories within 50 light years of its boundaries. And if they refuse, they won't. Valara's smile widened. But if they do, we declare the territories officially claimed and deploy our fleet to enforce the claim. Either way, we remind the galaxy why the Celestian Empire has remained unconquered for 10 million years. Below, Krax roared in triumph as he completed another perfect sequence, his blade singing through the air with lethal precision. The sound echoed through the arena, a promise of victory to come. Prepare the grand arena, Nexus, Valara commanded. I want everything ready when they accept. The galaxy shall witness the power of Celestian might, and these humans will finally learn their place in the cosmic order. Nexus bowed deeply and retreated, his armor chiming softly with each step. As he left, Valara returned her gaze to the holographic displays showing the human colonies. Soon, she thought, those presumptuous creatures would understand the true meaning of power. The lesson would be swift, decisive, and taught at the end of Krax's blade. The grand hall of Celestia Prime buzzed with anticipation. Thousands of nobles from across the Empire had gathered, their scales creating a mesmerizing light show as they shifted and moved. Queen Valara sat upon her elevated throne, watching with satisfaction as the human diplomatic shuttle made its final approach through the violet skies. The humans accepted far more quickly than anticipated. Your luminescence, Lord Nexus observed from his position beside the throne. Of course they did, Valara replied, her scales rippling with amusement. They are too proud to refuse, too convinced of their own superiority to recognize the trap they've walked into. The massive doors of the Grand Hall swung open. General Marcus Thompson of the Earth Defense Force strode in, flanked by his own diplomatic entourage. The humans looked almost comically small compared to the towering Celestians around them. Queen Valara Thompson announced, his voice carried and amplified by the hall's acoustic enhancement field. Earth accepts your challenge. We have brought our champion. Valara leaned forward slightly, her interest piqued. She had expected them to take longer to choose their warrior, perhaps even to attempt further negotiations. This swift acceptance suggested either foolishness or confidence. Present your champion then, General Thompson, she commanded. Let us see who dares to face Krax the Unyielding in combat. Thompson turned and gestured toward the entrance. The assembled Celestian nobles craned their necks, expecting perhaps some towering human specimen enhanced by their crude cybernetic technologies. Instead, a woman of average height walked in, wearing a simple black uniform without any visible weapons or armor. A wave of confused murmuring swept through the hall. Even Valara found herself momentarily speechless. This is Alexandra Reese, Thompson announced. She will represent Earth in the combat. Laughter erupted from the gathered nobles. Even the usually stoic royal guards seemed to be fighting back their amusement. The human woman appeared absolutely unremarkable by any standard. Is this some kind of joke? Lord Varax, the master of combat, called out from his position near the throne. Has Earth sent a maintenance worker by mistake? Alexandra Reese stood calmly in the center of the hall, seemingly unbothered by the mockery around her. Her eyes remained fixed on Queen Valara, her expression neutral but attentive. You insult us by sending such a specimen, Valara declared, rising from her throne. Her scales flashed warning patterns of deep crimson. Krax has defeated warriors twice his size. He has fought and killed creatures that could tear apart battle tanks. And you send us this. With respect, Your Majesty, Alexandra spoke for the first time, her voice clear and steady. Size isn't everything. Another wave of laughter rolled through the hall. Valara raised her upper right hand for silence, and the noise immediately ceased. Bring forth our champion, she commanded. The floor in the center of the hall split open, and a massive platform rose from below. Krax stood upon it, his forearms crossed over his chest, his ceremonial armor gleaming under the hall's lights. He towered over Alexandra, his muscled form making her look even more insignificant by comparison. This is who you send to face me, Krax's voice rumbled through the hall. I have killed predators larger than her during my morning exercises. Alexandra tilted her head slightly, studying Krax with what appeared to be professional interest. Impressive, though I notice you mentioned their size again. You folks seem rather fixated on that particular metric. Lord Varax stepped forward, his scales flashing with indignation. You dare mock our traditions? Our warriors. Not at all, Alexandra replied calmly. I'm simply making an observation. Shall we proceed with the formal arrangements? Queen Valara felt a slight twinge of unease at the human's composure. She had expected fear, or at least concern. This calm confidence was unsettling. The combat will take place tomorrow at mid-rise of the primary sun, Valara announced. As the challenge party, Earth has the right to choose the weapons. Hand-to-hand combat, Alexandra said immediately. No weapons, no armor, just skill against skill. The hall erupted in shocked whispers. Krax's face split in a predatory grin, his sharp teeth gleaming. You wish to face me unarmed, he asked incredulously. Without even the protection of armor? That's correct. General Thompson stepped forward quickly. "Miss Reese, perhaps we should discuss." "The choice has been made," Alexandra interrupted firmly. "As is my right under the combat protocols." Valara studied the human woman carefully. Either this was supreme confidence or supreme foolishness. Either way, it would make tomorrow's spectacle even more impressive. "So be it," the Queen declared. "Tomorrow, Craxx will face the human champion in unarmed combat. The winner's civilization shall have uncontested rights to the Crimson Belt and surrounding territories." As the assembled nobles began to disperse, still chattering about the bizarre choice of champion and even stranger choice of combat style, Lord Nexus leaned close to his queen. "There's something wrong here," he whispered. "The humans are many things, but they are not stupid. They would not send someone to die needlessly." Valara watched as Alexandra Reese turned to leave the hall, her movements smooth and economical, without a single wasted motion. "Perhaps," the Queen replied quietly. "But whatever game they're playing, it ends tomorrow. Craxx will crush her, and the galaxy will be reminded of Celestian supremacy." But as she watched the human woman disappear through the massive doors, Valara couldn't quite shake the feeling that she had missed something important. Something that might make tomorrow's combat far more interesting than anyone anticipated. The morning of the combat dawned with all three suns casting their light across the arena. Lord Nexus stood before the assembled dignitaries, his voice carried by the arena's acoustics to every corner of the massive structure. "For 10 million years, the combat arbitration has settled disputes among civilizations," he proclaimed. "Today we honor these ancient traditions. The rules are absolute, the outcome binding upon all parties." Alexandra Reese stood on one side of the arena's ceremonial circle, wearing the same simple black uniform as before. Across from her, Craxx's massive form seemed to pulse with barely contained energy. Between them, an array of traditional weapons lay displayed on a floating platform. "The challenged party has chosen unarmed combat," Nexus continued, his tone suggesting he still couldn't quite believe it. "But tradition demands the ceremony of refusal be observed. Each combatant must formally reject each weapon before combat can commence." Queen Valara watched from her royal box as the ceremony began. The first weapon, a curved blade of molecular-edged diamond, rose from the platform. "The Sword of Severance," Nexus announced. "Forged in the heart of a dying star, it can cut through battleship armor like paper. Do you reject this weapon?" "I reject it," Alexandra said calmly. "I reject it," Craxx rumbled, though he shot Alexandra a look that suggested she was insane. The next weapon rose, a pistol-like device covered in pulsing energy patterns. The quantum disruptor, capable of unraveling the atomic bonds of any target. "Do you reject this weapon?" Both combatants voiced their rejection. The ceremony continued through 27 traditional weapons, each more devastating than the last. With each rejection, the tension in the arena grew thicker. General Thompson shifted uncomfortably in his seat near the Queen's box. Is all this ceremony really necessary? They've already agreed to unarmed combat. "The ceremonies are as much a part of the combat arbitration as the fighting itself," Valara replied, not taking her eyes off the proceedings. "They remind us that this is not mere violence, but a civilized way of settling disputes." "Civilized," Thompson muttered. "Right." A massive hammer rose from the platform, crackling with contained lightning. The thunder gavel, said to be able to shatter moons. "Do you reject this weapon?" More rejections. Finally, the platform descended back into the arena floor, leaving the two combatants facing each other in the ceremonial circle. "The weapons have been rejected," Nexus declared. "Now comes the reading of the rules." He unfolded an ancient-looking scroll, its surface shimmering with holographic text. "Combat continues until one party yields or is rendered unconscious. Death is not permitted. Any lethal strike will result in immediate disqualification. The combat area is bounded by the ceremonial circle. Leaving the circle constitutes a forfeit." Alexandra rolled her shoulders, stretching her neck. Craxx watched her with predatory focus, all four of his arms flexing unconsciously. "Combat will begin when the chime of commencement sounds," Nexus continued. "Any violation of these rules will result in immediate forfeit and galactic censure of the violating civilization." The preparations had drawn every eye in the arena. Thousands of Celestians and a small contingent of humans watched as medical teams took their positions around the combat area. Monitoring drones hummed overhead, ready to record every moment of the historic encounter. Before combat begins, each participant may speak their piece, Nexus announced. Champion Krax, you may begin. Krax stepped forward, his massive form casting a shadow over Alexandra. I have fought in 10,000 battles. I have defeated creatures that could swallow you whole. Your death would bring me no honor, human. Yield now and spare yourself the humiliation. Alexandra simply smiled. Thank you for your concern, but I think I'll take my chances. Human champion Nexus said, you may speak your piece. I'm good. Thanks, Alexandra replied. Let's begin. A murmur of disapproval ran through the crowd. Even among species about to try to beat each other unconscious, there were proper forms to be observed. Queen Valara leaned forward slightly. Your champion shows little respect for our traditions, General Thompson. Alexandra has her own way of doing things, Your Majesty, Thompson replied. I've learned not to question it. High above the arena, 3 massive floating crystals began to pulse with light. When they aligned perfectly, they would create the chime of commencement. The crowd grew silent as the crystals slowly moved into position. Krax settled into a fighting stance, his forearms spread wide in a traditional guard position. Alexandra remained standing normally, her posture relaxed but alert. This is your last chance to withdraw, Lord Nexus announced. Once combat begins, it can only end in victory or defeat. Neither combatant moved or spoke. The crystals were nearly aligned. In her royal box, Queen Valara felt that nagging sense of unease return. Something about the human's calm demeanor suggested she knew something that the rest of them didn't. But what could one small human possibly? The crystals aligned. A pure note rang out across the arena, signaling the start of combat. Krax launched himself forward with frightening speed, all 4 arms moving in perfect coordination. Alexandra hadn't moved an inch. The gathered crowd held its breath, waiting for the moment of impact that would likely end the combat before it truly began. Time seemed to slow as Krax's massive form hurtled toward Alexandra. The crowd leaned forward, anticipating the moment of impact. Queen Valara's scales rippled with excitement. This would be over in seconds. Alexandra waited until the last possible instant. Then she moved. It wasn't a dodge, exactly. She simply wasn't where Krax's arms tried to grab her. A slight shift of weight, a minimal adjustment of position, and all 4 of his limbs closed on empty air. Krax's momentum carried him forward, but he recovered quickly, spinning with surprising grace for his size. His secondary arms lashed out in wide sweeping motions, while his primary arms jabbed straight ahead, a combination that had overwhelmed countless opponents. Alexandra moved again. Each motion was precisely calculated, using the minimum effort necessary to avoid contact. She seemed to flow around Krax's attacks like water around rocks. Stand and fight, human Krax growled, his attacks becoming faster, more aggressive. The air cracked with the speed of his strikes. Why, Alexandra asked calmly, still moving with that same efficient economy of motion. Your strategy relies on overwhelming force and multiple points of attack. Engaging directly would be pointless. The crowd watched in confused silence. This wasn't how combat was supposed to look. Where was the clash of forces? The dramatic exchanges of blows? Krax launched into one of his most devastating combinations, a sequence that used all 4 arms in a pattern designed to leave no escape route. Alexandra's response was subtle, a shift so minimal it was almost invisible, but it caused all 4 attacks to miss by millimeters. Stop dancing and fight, Krax roared, his frustration evident in the flaring of his combat ridges. I am fighting, Alexandra replied. You're just not paying attention. She moved again, and this time something was different. Instead of simply avoiding the attack, she brushed past one of Krax's secondary arms. The touch was so light it seemed inconsequential. Krax's arm went limp. The champion stared in shock at his unresponsive limb. "What did you?" "Pressure point manipulation," Alexandra explained, still moving with that same fluid efficiency. "Your species has remarkably similar nerve cluster patterns to humans, just scaled up." Krax snarled and pressed his attack with his remaining arms. His movements were still blindingly fast, but now there was an edge of desperation to them. The crowd began to murmur as they realized something unprecedented was happening. "Interesting," Alexandra commented as she wove between his strikes. "Your neural recovery rate is impressive. That arm will probably regain function in about 30 seconds. Unfortunately." Another light touch. Another limb went dead. "That's not fast enough." Queen Valara gripped the arms of her throne, her scales flashing patterns of disbelief. Lord Nexus stood rigid beside her, his ceremonial armor clicking as he shifted uncomfortably. "This is impossible," Valara whispered. "No one can defeat Krax this way. No one can." "Fascinating design," Alexandra continued, her voice still conversational as she disabled Krax's third arm. "Your muscle structure allows for incredible power generation, but it creates vulnerabilities at the nerve junction points." Krax stumbled back, now fighting with only one arm, his face contorted with a mixture of rage and dawning fear. "What are you?" "Just someone who pays attention to details," Alexandra replied. She stepped forward for the first time in the fight. "For instance, I noticed that your species tends to protect your primary arms at the expense of your secondary ones. A logical choice, given their importance in your culture, but it creates a predictable pattern in your defensive movements." The champion of the Celestian Empire, undefeated for 23,000 cycles, began to retreat. His remaining arm moved in defensive patterns, trying to protect his vital areas. "Wait," he said, his voice suddenly uncertain. "I." Alexandra stepped past his guard as if it wasn't there. Her hand moved in a precise arc, touching 3 points on his chest in rapid succession. Krax's legs buckled, and he crashed to his knees. "The neural cluster controlling your lower body locomotion," she explained. "Temporary paralysis. It will wear off in about 10 minutes. The arena was absolutely silent. Thousands of Celestians watched in stunned disbelief as their champion knelt helpless before a human half his size. "Do you yield?" Alexandra asked quietly. Krax stared up at her, all his confidence evaporated. What are you?" "I'm a student of biology, biomechanics, and pressure point combat," she replied. "I spent 6 months studying everything we know about Celestian physiology. Your species is fascinating, by the way. The way your nervous system interfaces with your bioluminescent scales is particularly interesting." She paused, then added, "But you still haven't answered my question. Do you yield?" Krax's combat ridges dulled, a sign of submission in Celestian culture. I yield." The words echoed through the silent arena. Alexandra stepped back and bowed slightly to her fallen opponent. "Thank you for an educational exchange," she said formally. "You should regain full motor function within 15 minutes. I'd recommend lying still until then to prevent any strain on your neural clusters." She turned to face the royal box, where Queen Valara sat frozen in shock. "I believe this concludes our combat arbitration, Your Majesty. The Crimson Belt and surrounding territories are now recognized as human space under galactic law." General Thompson stood, unable to hide his grin. "Well fought, Alexandra. Though you might have mentioned your particular qualifications when we selected you." "You didn't ask," she replied with a slight shrug. "Besides, I thought it would be more convincing this way." Queen Valara finally found her voice. This cannot be. The combat it wasn't. Was completely within the rules." Lord Nexus interrupted quietly. "No weapons were used, no lethal strikes attempted. The human champion won through skill alone." Alexandra nodded to the Queen. "If it helps, Your Majesty, you should know that Krax is indeed an incredibly skilled warrior. Against most opponents, his strategy would have been devastatingly effective. It's just that sometimes the best way to win a fight is to understand it doesn't need to be a fight at all." The crowd began to murmur, the sound growing as the implications of what they had witnessed sank in. The undefeated champion had been defeated not through superior strength or speed, but through knowledge and precision. Queen Valara's scales shifted through patterns of confusion, anger, and finally, reluctant acceptance. "The combat arbitration is concluded," she announced, her voice carrying across the arena. "The human claim to the disputed territories is recognized." As medical teams rushed to attend to cracks, Alexandra turned to leave the arena. She paused at the edge of the ceremonial circle and looked back at the fallen champion. "You might want to have your medical team study the nerve cluster arrangements in your secondary arm," she suggested. "There's an interesting redundancy pattern there that could be enhanced with proper training. Could make you even more formidable in the future." Then she walked away, leaving behind a stunned arena full of Celestians who had just learned that sometimes the most devastating force isn't force at all, but the quiet application of knowledge and skill. The great hall of Celestia Prime hummed with a different energy now. Where once there had been mockery and dismissal of humans, now there were thoughtful discussions and quiet revelations. Queen Valara sat upon her throne, watching as her nobles struggled to process what they had witnessed. "The medical team's report that Craxx has fully recovered," Lord Nexus announced, approaching the throne, "and he has made an unusual request." Valara's scales flickered with curiosity. What request? "He wishes to study human medical texts, particularly those relating to nerve system manipulation and pressure point techniques." Nexus paused. "He says he has much to learn." The Queen looked out over the assembled dignitaries. Human and Celestian representatives were mingling, their conversations animated. She noticed several of her warrior caste speaking intently with Alexandra Reese, who was drawing diagrams in the air using the hall's holographic interface. "The humans knew," Valara said quietly. "They knew exactly what they were doing when they sent her." "Yes, your luminescence, though perhaps not in the way we initially suspected." General Thompson approached the throne, bowing with perfect protocol. "Your Majesty, if I may, there's something you should know about Alexandra." Valara gestured for him to continue. "She's not just a combat specialist," Thompson explained. "She's one of Earth's leading xenobiologists. She's published several revolutionary papers on comparative alien physiologies. When we received your challenge, she actually requested the assignment." "A scientist," Valara said, her scales shifting to patterns of revelation. "Not a warrior at all." "That depends on your definition of warrior, Your Majesty. She believes that understanding is the key to everything, including combat." The Queen watched as Alexandra demonstrated a particular nerve cluster location to a group of fascinated Celestian medical officers. "And now she's freely sharing this knowledge with my people." "Knowledge grows when it's shared," Alexandra called out, apparently having overheard. She excused herself from the medical officers and approached the throne. "Your species has an incredible nervous system. The possibilities for medical advancement alone are staggering." "You could have kept these discoveries secret," Valara observed. "Used them as a tactical advantage." Alexandra shook her head. "That would be wasteful. Besides, I've already learned 3 new things about Celestian physiology just from analyzing Craxx's defensive responses. A fair trade, I'd say." The Queen's scales rippled with surprised amusement. "You were studying him even as you fought." "Everything's a learning opportunity," Alexandra replied with a slight smile. "For instance, the way your scales display emotional states. Fascinating adaptive response. Must have evolved as a way to facilitate complex social interactions in your species' early development stages." Valara found herself unconsciously interested. "Actually, our ancient texts suggest it was initially a hunting adaptation." The conversation flowed naturally into a discussion of evolutionary biology, drawing in nearby nobles and human delegates alike. The political tensions that had dominated the previous day seemed to evaporate in the face of shared intellectual curiosity. Several hours later, Lord Nexus found himself updating the official diplomatic records. The Crimson Belt territories were now officially recognized as human space, but with a significant addendum, a joint Celestian human research initiative would be established in the region, focusing on medical science and xenobiology. "Remarkable," he muttered, watching as Queen Valara and Alexandra pored over ancient Celestian medical texts together. From the brink of conflict to scientific collaboration in less than a day. That's often how it goes, General Thompson replied, standing beside him. Sometimes you need to prove yourself in one arena before you can cooperate in another. Across the hall, Cracksegg returned, moving somewhat stiffly, but with his dignity intact. To everyone's surprise, he went directly to Alexandra and bowed deeply. "Teacher," he said formally, "I would learn from you." Alexandra's eyes widened slightly. "Teacher? I thought I was just the human who got lucky." "You showed me that there is more to combat than force," Cracks replied. "More to strength than size. I would understand these things." The human scientist smiled. "Well, I'm particularly interested in studying the regenerative properties of your species' neural tissue. Perhaps we could help each other learn." Queen Valara watched this exchange with a mix of emotions playing across her scales. Not quite the outcome I expected when I issued the challenge, she admitted to Nexus. "Perhaps a better one, your luminescence." Perhaps the Queen's scales settled into patterns of contentment. Send word to the fleet. Tell them to begin preparations for the joint research initiative, and have our archivists prepare copies of all our medical texts for exchange with Earth's scientific community. As the day drew to a close, the Great Hall of Celestia Prime had transformed from a place of potential conflict to one of cultural exchange. Humans and Celestians gathered in small groups, sharing knowledge, asking questions, building bridges between their species, one conversation at a time. "You know," Alexandra said to Queen Valara as the three suns began to set, "I've always found it interesting how often pride leads to unexpected discoveries." "How so?" "Well, you challenged us expecting to prove Celestian superiority. Instead, you opened the door to something far more valuable: collaboration." She gestured to where Cracksex was intently studying a holographic display of human pressure points. "Sometimes the best victories aren't the ones we initially sought." Valara watched her former champion, now an eager student, and felt her scales shift to patterns of wisdom gained. "Indeed, though next time perhaps we could skip the combat and go straight to the scientific exchange." "Where would be the fun in that?" Alexandra grinned. "Besides, I still have so many questions about how your secondary arms maintain neural connectivity during high-speed combat maneuvers." The Queen found herself laughing, a sound that sent ripples of light cascading through her scales. Sometimes, she realized, the greatest strength lies not in proving your superiority, but in being willing to learn from those you once thought beneath you. And as the last sun set over Celestia Prime, two civilizations that had stood on the brink of conflict found themselves instead at the beginning of a beautiful partnership, built not on force or fear, but on the shared pursuit of knowledge and understanding.